The tenor bell broke on the 9th blow of the memorial peal, and every soul in the churchyard of Nether Ashcote heard it die. It did not stop. That was the horrible part. A cracked bell goes on speaking. The sound that came down out of the tower of Saint Botolph's on that grey October morning was not a note at all, but a flat, buzzing knock, like a spade struck against frozen ground, and it came round again in its turn, and again faithful and ruined, while the other 7 bells went on ringing their changes above it, as though nothing whatever had happened. 200 people stood on the wet grass between the yews with their hats in their hands. Nobody moved. The Duke of Hallowdene stood at the front of them, bareheaded, before the stone that carried his mother's name, and his face did not change, and the buzzing knock came round again. Somebody in the crowd began to laugh, and stopped. Near the light gate, at the back, where the servants and the village stood, a woman in a borrowed grey coat closed her eyes. She was not weeping. She had her head tipped a little to one side, the way a person tips it towards a door they are trying to hear through, and her lips moved once, silently, as though she were counting. "That is not my metal," said Hester Kell. She said it to nobody. She had spoken to nobody in that churchyard for 11 months, and nobody in it had spoken to her, and she had come out of the plate room at the great house that morning in a coat belonging to the second housemaid, because the whole household had been given leave to attend, and to stay behind would have been to invite a question. She had promised herself she would stand at the back and look at the grass. She had very nearly managed it. The ringing above them faltered, recovered, and fell apart. Somewhere in the tower a man was shouting. The bells came down one after another into silence, the small ones first, and the cracked tenor last of all, sounding twice more into the quiet before it was stilled, and each time it sounded a fresh flinch went through the crowd, as though a man with a broken leg were being made to walk. The Duke of Hallowdene turned round and looked at his parish. He was 36. He had buried his mother the previous autumn, and the ring of 8 bells hanging in that tower had been his gift to her memory, and it had cost him £1,900. He had waited a year for them to be hung and tuned and rung. He had been told, in writing, by 3 separate men, that they were the finest ring of 8 in the county. He had never in his life heard anything sound as wrong as they had sounded for the past 4 minutes. "Mr. Byfield," he said to the rector, "quite pleasantly, what has happened to my bells?" And the rector, who was 70 and frightened, said the thing that had already been decided for him a year before. The thing everybody in the county knew, the thing that had been printed in the Marlbrook paper, and repeated at every dinner table between Hallowdene and Devizes. "Your Grace," he said, "they were badly cast." The woman in the borrowed coat did not raise her head. She stood among the laundry maids with her hands folded and let it go over her like weather. She had heard it said so many times that it had worn smooth like a coin that has been in too many pockets, badly cast. She had cast 6 of those 8 bells with her own hands and tuned every one of them on her father's vertical lathe, and she knew to 1/8 of a tone what each of them had said on the day it left the foundry yard, and she knew what all 8 of them had said that morning, and the difference between the 2 was the whole of her life. She lifted her head then, only a little, and looked at the tower. Afterwards she could not have said what she expected to see. Grey flint and clunch, a squat perpendicular tower with a stair turret and a lead roof, lovered sound holes on all 4 faces, and behind the Louvre is nothing but darkness and the smell of pigeons and old timber. She had never been inside it. In all the time those bells had hung there, she had never once been permitted past the ringing chamber door. She looked at the tower, and she thought, I do not know what is up there. It was not a noble thought. It was not the thought of a wronged woman rising towards her vindication. It was a plain professional itch, the same itch that had made her father cut open a badly behaved bell at his own expense in 1802 to find out why it grumbled, and it settled into her chest that morning, and it did not come out again. 30 yards away, the Duke of Hallowdene was saying something about a subscription for a new tenor, and the churchwardens were nodding, and Mr. Silas Prout of the Marlbrook Bell Foundry, in a good black coat, was standing at the Duke's elbow with his hat pressed to his breast, explaining in a low, respectful voice how the fault could only have come from the original casting, and how he had said so at the time, and how, if His Grace would permit him, he would put the matter right at cost. Hester Kell walked back to the great house alone, 3/4 of a mile by the field path, and let herself in at the scullery door, and put on her apron, and spent the rest of that day polishing the Hallowdene plate with rotten stone and spirits of wine, until the tarnish came away, and other men's names came up underneath it, engraved and clean. Her father had been the last of 4 generations. Kell and Son, bell founders of Marlbrook in Wiltshire, established, said the letterhead, in 1698, and there had not been a son since 1774. Josiah Kell had 1 child, and she was born in the year the foundry cast the ring of 6 for Winterslow, and she was carried into the moulding shed at 9 days old because there was nobody at home to hold her. She grew up in loam. That was the first thing she remembered, and the thing she smelled all her life afterwards whenever she was frightened: wet clay, horse dung, chopped hay, and goat hair beaten together into the black mud out of which bell moulds are built. Her earliest work was treading it. Her second was carrying rushlights for the men who worked the sweepboard, that pivoted arm with a shaped iron plate upon it, which swings round a central spindle, scraping the profile of the bell out of the mud as it turns. By 14 she knew what her father knew, which was that the whole art lay in the thickness. He told her so at the sweepboard, with his hands in the clay to the wrist. They will tell you a bell is tuned with a chisel, he said. It is not. A bell is tuned before ever the metal is poured. It is tuned here. And he laid 1 black finger against the swell of the profile at its thickest place, the soundbow, where the clapper would strike. The metal is the voice, he said, and the shape is the words. Get the shape wrong, and no chisel on earth will mend it. There was more to it than any one man could hold in his head, and Josiah Kell held very little of it in his head. He held it in a book. The book was foolscap, bound in dark calf, and it was called The Tally, and it had been begun by his grandfather. It contained no secrets in the way a stranger would understand the word. It contained numbers. For every bell the house had cast in 120 years, the tally gave the diameter at the lip, the height, the thickness at the soundbow, the weight in hundredweight and quarters and pounds, the proportion of the alloy, the date of the pour, the name of the parish, and, in a narrow column that Josiah's father had added and Josiah himself had widened, the note. Not 1 note. 5. Hester learned the 5 before she learned her catechism, because they were the family religion. A bell does not sing a note. It sings a chord, and the chord is not a comfortable one. Strike a bell and you set going a whole family of tones at once, each of them a different way the metal has of moving. Highest of those that matter is the nominal, an octave above the note you believe you are hearing. Below that the quint, a fifth. Below that the tierce, which in every bell cast since the world began, is a minor third, and which is the reason a great bell always sounds a little in mourning even at a wedding. Below that the prime, the note the ear reports to you, and below all of them, so low that most people never hear it at all, but only feel it in the breastbone and in the soles of the feet. The hum. The hum is the one that carries, her father said. 2 miles off on a still night. That is all you have got. Nobody listens for it, and it is the one that does the work. Most founders in England in the year 1817 tuned by ear and by nerve. They hung the raw bell mouth upwards upon a vertical lathe, set it turning, and took metal off the inside with a fixed chisel until it pleased them, and if the tierce was foul, they hoped nobody would ask. Josiah Kell tuned by number. He owned a set of 11 tuning forks in a japanned tin box, made for him by a London instrument maker named Ransom in 1788, each stamped with its pitch, and a monochord, a plain deal box 4 feet long with a single brass wire, and a movable bridge and a scale of divisions inked along its side. With those 2 things and a good ear he could take a bell to pieces and tell you every voice in it. And when his eyes began to fail in 1811, and then failed altogether, it was his daughter's ear that he used. Nobody outside the yard knew. That was not concealment so much as arithmetic. The foundry had 8 men and a great many debts, and a book of orders that depended entirely upon the name Kell, and a blind founder is a founder nobody trusts, and a woman founder is not a founder at all, but a curiosity, a thing to be put in a newspaper. So the letters went out over his signature, and the invoices went out over his signature. And Hester stood at his shoulder at the lathe with the forks in her hand, and told him what she heard, and he told her where to cut, and by 1813 she was telling him where to cut, and he was agreeing, and by 1815 he had stopped coming out to the lathe at all. She cast the ring of 10 for Chippenham in that manner. She cast the tenor for St. Mary Marlbrook, 130 hundredweight, the heaviest bell hung in the county in 20 years. And she was 28, and she stood in the casting pit in a leather apron, with her hair tied up in a rag, and watched 2 tons of bell metal go down the runner in 11 seconds. And when it was cool, and dug out, and hoisted, and she struck it with the tuning hammer, the nominal came back to her, a bare quarter comma sharp of where she had written that it would be. She entered the true figure in the tally beneath the predicted one, as her grandfather had done, and put the date, and initialed it. And then she did what her father had done, and his father before him. She took a cold chisel and set 3 small nicks inside the crown of the bell, up under the cannons where no eye would ever find them unless it was looking, 2 together and 1 apart. The wolf's tooth. It had been on every bell the house had cast since 1698, and there was no reason for it any longer, and neither of them would have dreamed of leaving it off. Josiah Kell died in the January of 1816, in the room above the counting house, with the window open, because he said he could hear the 6 at Ogbourne, and wanted to know whether they had let the 5th go sour again. Hester was 30. She sat with the tally book upon her knees for 2 days, and then she opened the yard on the Monday morning, because there were 4 bells on order and 11 people who ate by the foundry. And there was nobody else. There was, of course, somebody else. There was Silas Prout. He had come to Kell & Son at 19 as a journeyman moulder, and had been there 22 years, and he was a good moulder and a very good judge of a furnace, and he had a real gift, which Hester never once denied him for the management of men. He could get a crew to work through a night in February, and have them cheerful at dawn. He knew the temper of a metal by the color of its skin. He was, in the ordinary meaning of the word, a bell-founder. He could not tune. It was not for want of trying. Josiah had spent 4 winters on him. Prout could hear the nominal most of the time. He could hear the prime. The tierce escaped him about as often as it did not, and the hum, the note that carries, he had never in his life heard at all, and had at last admitted as much in the yard one evening in 1809. Josiah had said, kindly enough, that it was no shame, that the ear was a thing a man was given or was not, and had gone on tuning the bells himself. That kindness had lain in Prout's chest for 7 years and gone bad, as a kindness will when a man cannot pay it back. When Josiah died, Prout came to Hester in the counting-house and offered to buy the foundry. She had expected it, and she had the answer ready, that she had no wish to sell and every wish to keep him at a better wage, as foreman and master of the furnace, for as long as he cared to stay. She wrote it into an agreement and signed it, and he signed it, and for a while it served, and the yard cast a ring of 5 for Ramsbury and a clock bell for a mill at Devizes. And then, in the April of 1816, the letter came from Hallowdene Court. The letter was not from the Duke. It was from Mr. Gideon Vellicott, agent and man of business to His Grace the Duke of Hallowdene, and it was a model of its kind, courteous, exact, and arranged so that every advantage lay quietly on one side of the page. His Grace was raising and re-roofing the tower of Saint Botolph's at Nether Ashcote. His Grace desired a ring of 8, the tenor to be of some 21 hundredweight, in the key of F, to hang in a new oak frame. The gift was made at the particular wish of His Grace's mother, the Dowager Duchess Cecilia, who had been born in the parish and who was, Mr. Vellicott wrote, in indifferent health. The whole was to be completed within the 12-month. The sum agreed was £1,900. There was one further clause, and Hester read it 3 times. The metal was to be found by the estate. Mr. Vellicott would purchase the copper and the tin himself, upon His Grace's account, from Messrs. Rowbotham and Sons of Bristol, and deliver it to the foundry at Marlbrook. And the foundry would be paid for its labour, its moulds, its coal and its tuning, and not for the metal. Prout thought it a great piece of luck. It halved the money they must find in advance, and metal was the ruin of small foundries. A man could be broken between the day he bought his copper and the day he was paid for his bells. Hester sat with the letter on her knee for an hour, and could not say what troubled her, and at last decided it was nothing but her own dislike of not holding the thing in her own hands. She wrote back, and accepted, and asked only that the metal be delivered whole and at once, and weighed in by her, and that she be given the tower to tune in when the bells were hung. Mr. Vellicott replied that both requests were of course entirely reasonable. She began in the May. A ring of 8 is not 8 bells. It is one instrument in 8 pieces, and the pieces have to be built against each other from the beginning. She sat for 4 evenings with the tally and the monochord, and laid out the whole scale on paper before she touched a spade full of loam, the tenor at F, 1 20 cwt, 48 inches across the lip, and then the 7th, the 6th, the 5th, and up to the treble, each one a step in the scale, each one with its diameter and its thickness, and the 5 voices she intended it to have when it was finished, written down in ink before it existed. The bells were promised before they were made. The tally did not record what a bell had turned out to be. It recorded what she had said it would be. And then, underneath, in a second line, what it was. Her father used to hold the book open at that double column and say, "Any man can tell you what a thing is once it is standing in front of him." That is not knowledge. Knowledge is the top line. The moulding took the summer. Each bell was built twice, in a manner of speaking, and destroyed once, the core raised in loam upon a brick foundation, and swept to the inner profile and dried with a slow fire inside it for 2 days. Then the thickness, a false bell of clay swept over the core in the exact shape of the metal that was to come. Then the cope, the outer mould, built over the thickness and bound with iron and dry. Then the cope lifted, the thickness broken away and thrown back into the pit, and the cope lowered again onto the core, leaving between them a hollow the precise shape of a bell and full of nothing but air. Into the thickness, before it was destroyed, went the inscription, wooden letters, waxed and set into the clay, so that the words stood out on the cope, and would stand out on the finished bronze, cast in one piece with it, and no more removable than the note. Each of the 8 carried the same band about its waist, and Hester set the letters herself, on her knees on a plank, with the tally propped open beside her. Cecilia, Duchess of Hallowdene, desired that I should sing here. And beneath it, in smaller letters, as the house had done since 1698, Kell of Marlbrook, M.E., Fecit, 1816. The medal came in the last week of June, on 4 wains, and she weighed it in herself at the yard gate as she had asked to do, and it was then, standing in the sun with a tally slate and a piece of chalk, that Hester Kell first understood that something was wrong. A ring of 8 of those weights wanted a little above 5 tons of metal, allowing for the runners and the heads and the waist, which is never small. What came off the wains was copper in slabs and tin in blocks, sound and clean, well enough. It came to 3 tons and 1100 weight. She said so to Prout in the counting house that evening, with the slate in front of her. Prout said the rest was coming. She wrote to Mr. Wiltshire. Mr. Wiltshire replied within the week, in the same courteous hand, that a difficulty had arisen in the Cornish market, that his Grace was unwilling to see the work delayed, and that his Grace had therefore directed that the 2 heavy bells, the tenor and the 7th, be placed elsewhere, with a London house long employed by the family, and that Kell and Son should proceed with the 6 upon the terms already agreed, less the proportion. Hester read it standing up, and then she sat down. She wrote back the same night, and she kept the draft, and it was that draft, folded in 8, and carried for a year in the lining of a work-bag, that afterwards mattered more than anything else she ever wrote. She said that a ring of 8 cannot be made in 2 places, She said that the 6 she was casting were being built to a scale, and that the 2 heaviest bells were the floor upon which the other 6 stood, and that unless the London house were sent her figures and bound to them, the ring would not be a ring but a quarrel. She said that if his grace persisted, she must at the least be permitted to tune all 8 together in the tower after they were hung, as had been agreed, and she would do it at her own charge and take no fee for it. Mr. Vellicott's reply was 2 lines long. His Grace's directions were not to be reopened. The tower would be in the hands of the hangers and afterwards of the churchwardens, and access was not in Mr. Vellicott's gift. She cast the 6. She cast them well. She would say that afterwards, in the worst of it, lying awake in a servant's bed under a slate roof at 2 in the morning, with the whole county certain she was a fraud, she had cast them well. The first pour was on the 12th of July, the treble and the second together, and the metal went in bright and came out clean, and the 6th, the heaviest of hers, at 14 hundredweight 2 quarters, was poured on the 4th of August in a thunderstorm with the whole crew working in wet leather. The alloy was 13 of copper to 4 of tin, which is a little above 23 parts of tin in the 100, and which is not a secret and never has been, and is written in the front of the tally in her great-grandfather's hand with the note, less tin makes a soft bell, a short one. Too little tin and the metal is tough and dead, and will not ring. Too much and it is glass and will fly apart on the first frost. Between them there is a narrow country, and every founder in England lives in it. She tuned them in September on her father's lathe, the bell inverted, mouth upward, chained to the faceplate, turning slowly under the weight of a man and a boy on the crank, and the fixed chisel going in on its rest to take a bright curl of bronze off the inside. Take metal from the inside of the soundbow the thickest place, and the nominal comes down. Take it a little higher, from the waist, and the tierce moves. Take it from the shoulder, near the crown, and the hum shifts, and the hum is the slowest and the sulkiest, and will forgive nothing. Every cut is final. There is no putting metal back onto a bell. She stopped the lathe 40 or 50 times to a bell, and struck it with a hammer wrapped in leather, and held a fork against the crown, and listened. And when she could no longer trust her ear, she went out into the yard, and stood in the cold for 10 minutes, and came back and listened again. It took her 9 days. At the end of it she wrote the second line under each of the 6. And the second line and the first were the same within a comma and a half on every bell but the 5th, where the tierce came out 4 cents flat, and she noted it and let it stand. Because a tierce a little flat is a sorrow, and a tierce sharp is a wound. Then she set the wolf's tooth inside each crown, 2 nicks together and 1 apart, and stamped the core number beside it, and had them loaded, and watched them go out of the yard on the road to Nether Ashcote. The Dowager Duchess Cecilia died on the 11th of October 1816 at Hallowdene Court of a disorder of the chest, and the bells that she had asked for were at that hour lying in the churchyard under tarpaulins, waiting for the frame to be finished. They were hung in the November by a firm of hangers out of Salisbury. Hester went over twice, and was turned back at the tower door both times, once by a workman who was civil, and once by Mr. Vellicott's under-agent, who was not. On the second occasion she stood in the churchyard for half an hour in the rain and looked up at the sound holes, and heard the hangers shouting, and a bell swing once, unclappered, with a soft rush of air, and she went home. The ring was opened on the 4th of December with a peal of grandsire triples attempted by the Nether Ashcote band and abandoned after 11 minutes. Hester was in the churchyard for it, at the front in her good coat, with her father's japanned box of forks in her pocket, because in spite of everything she had expected to be sent for. She heard the first blow and knew. It is difficult to explain to a person who has not stood under a ring of bells what it is that one hears in such a moment, and she gave up trying to explain it years later. The nearest she ever came was this: a good ring of 8 is 8 strangers who have agreed on something. A bad ring is 8 strangers all talking at once about different matters, and one of them is drunk. The 6 were there. She heard her own 6 come round in their turn like 6 people she knew by their footsteps. And underneath them and across them came 2 others, and they did not belong. The 7th was flat and hollow, and it had no life in it at all. It did not ring so much as report, a heavy dull knock that fell out of the pattern and left a hole. And the tenor, the great bell, the floor of the whole ring, was worse. It was near enough to F that a man in a field a mile off would have called it F. It was not F. It was some way under, and its tierce was so foul and so wide that every time it spoke it dragged the 6 above it out of true, and the ear, hunting for the ground it stood on, found the ground moving. She stood with her hand over her mouth. Beside her a farmer said to his wife that it was a grand noise, and his wife said it was. The band gave up. The rector came out. Mr. Vellicott came down from the tower with his hat in his hand and his face composed, and behind him came Silas Prout in a new coat, and Prout looked at Hester once, across 20 feet of wet churchyard, and looked away again, and that was the moment, she thought afterwards, at which she had already lost, though it took another 3 weeks to be told so. The inquiry, if it deserved the word, was held in the vestry on the 19th of December, and lasted from 11 until 12:15. Mr. Vellicott laid the case out. His Grace had commissioned a ring of 8. 6 of those bells had been cast at Marlbrook by Kell and Son. 2 had been placed with another house upon His Grace's direction. When the Marlbrook works proved unable to find metal for the heavy bells, the ring had been hung by reputable men, and it was not fit to be rung. Where, Mr. Vellicott asked the room, was the fault likely to lie, in 2 bells or in 6? Prout was called and gave his evidence standing, with his hat on the table and his hands behind him, and it was the cleverest thing Hester ever saw a man do, because he did not accuse her of anything at all. He said that Mr. Josiah Kell had been the finest tuner in the west of England, and that he, Prout, had been proud to serve under him for 22 years. He said that Mr. Kell had gone blind in his last years, and had been obliged to lean upon others. He said that Miss Kell was a most industrious young woman, who had done her utmost. He said that the tuning of a ring of 6 was a heavy charge for anyone. He said he had been uneasy in his own mind through the whole of the summer, and had spoken of it to nobody, and that he wished now that he had. He said all this in a low, unhappy voice, and twice he stopped as if he could not go on, and by the end of it there was not a man in that vestry who did not believe he was listening to a decent fellow doing a hard thing. Hester was asked whether she had anything to say. She had a great deal to say. She had the draft of her letter of the 28th of June in her hand, and she read it out, that a ring of 8 cannot be made in 2 places, that the 2 heavy bells were the floor upon which the other 6 stood, that she had asked to be allowed to tune all 8 together in the tower at her own charge, and had been refused. Mr. Vellicott said, courteously, that no such letter had been received. She said she had the draft. Mr. Vellicott observed, still courteously, that a draft is not a letter, and that anybody might write a draft at any time, and that he was sorry to have to say so. The rector looked at the table. Old Ned Curbishley, who had rung at Saint Botolph's for 40 years, and who was the only man in the room who had heard the difference and understood it, opened his mouth and shut it again, and afterwards told his wife that he had been a coward, and afterwards still was the first man in the parish to stand up for her, which is how such things generally go. The Marlbrook and Devises paper had it the following week under the heading A, Caution to Subscribers, and it did not name her, which was worse, because it wrote instead of the late Mr. Kell's establishment, now conducted by a female. The rest was quick, and had, she came to think, been arranged long before the 4th of December. Her father had died owing £600 on a mortgage of the yard, held by a Marlbrook attorney named Pillinger, and the interest had been paid punctually, and the debt had sat there quietly for 11 years, and would have gone on sitting. On the 2nd of January, the mortgage was called in. Pillinger had assigned it in November to a client whose name did not appear. She had no money and no orders, because a founder who has publicly ruined a ducal ring of 8 has no orders, and there was nothing to be done. The yard, the sheds, the pit, the 2 furnaces, the sweep boards, the cranes, the lathe her grandfather had built and her father had rebuilt, the strickle boards for 120 years of bells, and the books of the concern were sold together on the 11th of March. Silas Prout bought them for £150. She stood at the back of the sale and watched him do it, and she did not know until the auctioneer read the schedule that the books of the concern included the tally. She went to him afterwards in the yard, in front of everybody, and asked for it. She said he might have the yard and welcome. She said the tally was 120 years of one family's work, and was of no earthly use to him, since it recorded bells he had not cast in a language he did not read. Prout said that the books were an asset of the concern, and had been fairly bought. She said, and it was the only time in the whole business that she raised her voice, that he could not read it. He said quite gently that she could not prove that either. Of the whole of her inheritance she kept 2 things. One was a folded draft in the lining of her work-bag. The other was the japanned tin box of 11 tuning forks, which went into the sale in a lot with a broken theodolite and a box of files, and was bought for 4 shillings by a neighbour named Mrs. Sarah Tapp, who walked round to the back door that evening and put it into Hester's hands and said she had no notion what they were for, and had thought Hester might. The year that followed had very little in it. She wrote to 2 houses in Gloucester and 2 in Bristol, offering herself as a tuner at journeyman's wages, and named her father, and had 1 reply, which was kind, and said no. She mended pewter. She sold her mother's ring. In the spring she was 3 days without a proper meal, and slept in a barn near Avebury, and was too proud to be frightened, and was frightened. What she could not get used to was the silence. She had lived her whole life within 400 yards of a furnace and 8 men, and had spent 30 years listening to things professionally, and now nothing wanted her ear at all. In July in Marlbrook, she heard a ring of 6 she had helped to tune at 19, and stood in the street until they had finished, and then sat down on a mounting block and put her hands over her face for a while, and then got up and walked on. In the August of 1817, she took a place at Hallowdene Court. She had not sought it out of any design. The advertisement was for a woman able to take charge of the plate room, and it specified a person handy with a graver and a burnisher, because the house had a great deal of old silver, and the last woman had ruined a pair of sauce boats with sand. Mrs. Dinley, the housekeeper, interviewed her in the still room and asked her whether she could mend a broken salt spoon, and Hester borrowed a lamp and a scrap of hard solder and mended one on the table in 11 minutes, and Mrs. Dinley said she might begin on the Monday at £12 a year and her keep. Nobody asked her what her father had been. Servants are not asked. She gave her name plainly as Hester Kell, and it meant nothing to anybody in the house, because the name of a founder is not a thing that travels below stairs, and because in that parish the bells were already, in every mouth, Prout's bells. The plate room at Hallowdene was a stone-floored closet behind the butler's pantry, with a barred window, a lead-lined sink, a scrubbed deal table, and a fire she was allowed to light on 3 days in the week. In it she kept rotten stone and whiting and spirits of wine, chamois and hog's bristle, and a small kit of her own, 2 gravers, a burnisher, a spirit lamp, a set of needle files, and a loop. It was the smallest world she had ever lived in, and it was made entirely of metal. And after a month she found, with a kind of shame, that she was not unhappy in it. 6 days in the week she cleaned other men's names. The Hallowdene plate went back to the first duke, salvers with the arms of families that had married in and out, a rose-water dish of 1671, tankards, a Monteith, 4 dozen forks. Tarnish is a skin. You take it off with rotten stone and spirits and a rag wrapped tight over your finger, and you work along the engraving and never across it. And what comes up out of the black, slowly, letter by letter, is somebody's name, cut by a man dead 200 years. She did 4 pieces a day and thought about nothing. She learned the plate the way she had learned bells, which was the only way she knew. Within 6 weeks she could have told a stranger the date letter, the maker's mark, and the assay town of any piece in that room from across it. And she kept a list, because Mrs. Dinley wanted one, and because she could not help it. Of the Duke she saw almost nothing that autumn. He was in the house and not in it. He had come into the title at 34 on the death of a father he had not liked, and had lost his mother 2 years after, and the servants said he had been a cheerful man once, and the servants said a great many things. What Hester knew of him was that he kept unreasonable hours, that he had stopped going to church in the December of 1816, and had not been seen there since, except upon the anniversary, and that Bess Treadgold, the second housemaid, who was 17 and kind, and lent Hester her coat for that anniversary, had twice found him in the long gallery at 4 in the morning, doing nothing at all. 4 days after the tenor cracked, he came into the plate room. It was 11:30 at night. Hester had the lamp lit and the rose-water dish on a folded blanket in front of her, and had got about 1/3 of the way round the border, and she had the window open 2 inches because the spirits made her head ache, and through the 2 inches thin and far off across a mile of wet park came the sound of the church clock at Nether Ashcote striking the half-hour on the 7th bell. She stopped with the rag on the silver and tipped her head. "There is nothing there," she said aloud. "There is no hum in it at all." The Duke said, "From the doorway I beg your pardon." She got up so fast that she knocked the burnisher off the table. He was standing in the passage with a candle in his hand, in his shirt sleeves, unshaven, and he looked like a man who had been walking about a house for several hours, because lying down had failed. She had never been within 30 feet of him. She said, "I am sorry, Your Grace," and stood with her hands at her sides. He said, "You said there was no hum in it." She said, "Yes," he said, "what does that mean?" And Hester Kell, who had had 11 months to learn better, and who had every reason on earth to say that it meant nothing and that she had spoken out of turn, looked at the floor for about 2 seconds and then said, "It means that the 7th bell in your tower is not bell metal, Your Grace. It has lead in it. Lead will not let a bell ring. It takes the hum away first, because the hum is the slowest, and a slow note is the first thing a soft metal kills. That is why it sounds to you like a man knocking on a door. It has sounded so since the day it was hung, and it is not the fault of the 6. He did not believe her. He would say so later, in front of a good many people, and it did him no harm in the saying. What he did instead of believing her was to set down the candle on the plate room table and say, "Prove that to me now." Hester considered the room she had. She said, "Your Grace, will you strike that dish?" He struck the rose-water dish of 1671 with the back of a fork, and it gave out a thin, sweet ring, and she said, before it had died, that it was a shade under E, and would be exactly E if the rim had not been dented at 4 o'clock. And she opened the japanned box and set the fork upon the table, and let him hear the two together, and he stood quite still and heard the difference. He struck a tankard, and she named it. He struck the Monteith, and she named it, and then said that it had been repaired at the foot, and that the solder was too soft and was killing the note, and that she had noticed it a fortnight before, and had put it on Mrs. Dingley's list. He said, anyone might learn a room of silver by heart. She said, "Yes, Your Grace." They went out into the stable yard at 1/4 midnight, with a lantern. The stable bell at Hallowdene hangs in a cote over the arch, and is rung by a rope at the corner of the tack room, and it is not a bell anyone had thought about in 50 years. She stood under the arch and looked up at it in the lantern light for perhaps half a minute, at the shape of its shoulder and the swell of its soundbow, and the 6 loops on the crown. And then she said, "It is Rood Hall of Gloucester, and I should say 1720 or a little after. It will give a G, a hand's breadth sharp, and it is cracked. Not through. There is a lift at the soundbow on the far side from us. Somebody has put a clapper in it out of a larger bell, and it has been beating a bell of 100 weight with the ball of a bell of 3, and it has been doing it for years. The Duke sent a boy up the ladder with the lantern. There was a crack at the soundbow, 4 inches long, on the far side. The clapper was too big. It had been changed in 1809, the head groom said, when the old one broke, and they had taken one out of the stable at Ashcote Priory, because it was there. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the Duke said, in a perfectly level voice, "Ring it." The boy rang it, and it gave a G sharp, and the crack buzzed in it like a fly in a jar, and the Duke stood in the middle of his own stable yard at 1/2 midnight in his shirt sleeves, and listened to a bell for the first time in his life. He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Hester Kell." He said nothing at all for what seemed to her a very long time, and then he said, "Kell of Marlbrook." She said, "Yes." He said, "You cast my mother's bells." She said, "I cast 6 of them." The Duke of Hallowdene put his hand over his eyes for a moment, in the manner of a man doing a sum he does not want the answer to. And then he said, "Be in the churchyard at 7. It was not light at 7. It was the 21st of October, and the sky was the color of a pewter plate, and there was a wind coming off the down that got into the sleeves. Ned Curbishley was in the ringing chamber with 2 of his band and a lantern, and the Duke was in the churchyard in a black greatcoat, and the rector had been got out of bed and stood by the porch, looking from one to the other of them, and Mrs. Dinley and 4 of the servants had found reasons to be walking past. The Duke had written 8 numbers on a sheet of paper, in an order he had chosen himself, and he had shown the paper to nobody but the rector, and he had folded it and given it to the rector to hold. Ned Curbishley had a copy of the same order sent up sealed. Hester stood at the foot of the tower with her back to it, and her father's forks in her hand, and the arrangement was this. At each stroke she would name which of the 8 had been chimed, and then she would name its voices, and the rector would write it down. The first blow came down out of the loaves, and she said, "That is the 4th. Nominal C. 3 cents flat of where I meant it. Prime the C below. Tierce E flat. 4 cents flat. Quint G. 9 cents sharp, which is where I left it, because the bell would not give me the metal. Hum. The C below the prime, and it is true." The rector wrote. The Duke's face did not move. "The second blow," she said. "Second bell. Nominal E flat." And so through them, and it took 11 minutes, and she did not once ask for a stroke to be repeated, and did not once correct herself. At the end the rector unfolded the Duke's paper, and read out the order he had written at midnight, and it was 1, 4, 6, 3, 5, 2, and then the 7th, and then the tenor, and Hester's names were the same 8 in the same places. Of the 7th and of the tenor she had said something else. At the 7th she had stood a moment with her head down, and then said, "I did not cast that bell, and I cannot tell you what is in it, because I do not know what its maker put there. I can tell you that its nominal is A flat, and better than a quarter tone under where a bell of that size in this ring must stand. I can tell you it has a tierce so broad and so dead I would not call it a tierce, and I can tell you it has no hum, not a weak hum, none. A bell without a hum has lead in it, or it is cracked all the way through, and that bell is not cracked, because a crack you would hear is a buzz, and there is no buzz. It has lead in it." And at the tenor, the great bell, the cracked one, she had listened to the ugly knocking of it for longer than she listened to any of the others. And then she said, "And the rector's pen stopped, your grace. That bell is old." The Duke said, "What?" she said. "I do not mean it was badly made. I mean it is old. Under the crack there is a bell that has been rung for a very long time. I can hear the soundbow. It is worn hollow where the clapper strikes, and a hollow soundbow makes a nominal that spreads. That does not happen in a year. That is 50 years of ringing, or 80, or 100. Whatever is hanging in your tower under my mother's inscription, it was not cast in 1816. The rector said faintly that surely one could not hear such a thing. Hester said that one could hear it the way he could tell a young man's voice from an old man's without seeing either. The Duke said, "Mr. Byfield, I want the key of the tower." They went up at 9. When it was properly light, the Duke, Hester, Ned Curbishley with 2 lanterns, and the rector who came because he was afraid not to. Up the newel stair to the ringing chamber, where the ropes hung with their red and white sallies, up a ladder through a trap into the clock chamber, where the going train ticked in its iron frame, and the dust lay an inch thick on the sill, and up a second ladder through a second trap into the bell chamber, and out of the dark and the pigeon smell the frame stood up around them, new oak, pale, smelling still faintly of the saw, and in it, mouth down, 8 bells. Hester had not seen her own work for 11 months. She went along the frame with a lantern held low and her free hand on the metal. The treble first, then the second. The bronze was cold and slightly greasy with the film that new bells carry, and the letters of the inscription band ran under her fingers as she walked, raised and rounded, each letter a little proud of the surface with the soft edge that cast lettering has, because it is not cut into the metal but grown out of it, and she had set those letters herself into the clay on her knees on a plank. Cecilia, Duchess of Hallowdene, desired that I should sing here. Her hand came to the end of the band, and to the line below it, and stopped. The line below it was not raised. It was sunk. Her fingertips went down into the letters instead of over them, and the walls of the cuts were sharp and square where a graver had gone in, and the metal round about was bright and flat, and faintly ridged where it had been ground. She brought the lantern up. The founder's line on the treble bell of Nether Ashcote read Prout of Marlbrook M.E. Fessett, 1816. Cut into a ground flat, and along the bottom edge of the flat, where the grinding had stopped a little short, there was left the lower quarter of a row of letters that had been there before, the feet of them, the small serifed feet, a K and 2 L's, and the tail of an F. She stood with her hand on it. Behind her the Duke said, "What is it?" She could not answer him at once. She went to the second bell, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and every one of them was the same. Her band raised above, her name ground away below, and another man's name cut into the scar. Somebody had come up into that tower with a grinder and a set of gravers, and had spent, she thought, 3 or 4 days in the dark, alone, taking her off her own bells 1 letter at a time. Ned Curbishley said, in the voice of a man who has just understood something he has been standing next to for months. Master Mead. The letter cutter out of Bath. He was up here in the March. 4 days. Mr. Vellicott had the key. Hester said to the Duke, without turning round, these 6 are mine. He has taken my name off them and put his own on. That is a thing I can prove, and I will prove it. But it is not the worst thing in this tower, and I want you to come and put your hand on the 7th. They went along the frame. She took the Duke's wrist, which she would never afterwards be able to account for, and set his fingers against the waist of the 7th bell, and moved them along the inscription. Every letter went down, the band, the memorial, the whole of it, sunk, cut, incised, walled, and sharp, on a face that had been ground flat from shoulder to lip. There was no cast lettering anywhere upon that bell. There never had been. She said, quietly, a bell's inscription is made in the mold before the metal is poured. It comes out of the fire with the words already in it, standing up. You cannot cast a word onto a bell afterwards. If the words are sunk, they were put there with a chisel, by a man standing on a plank, on a bell that already existed, and already said something else. Then she took the lantern to the tenor. The tenor hung at the north end of the frame, and it was so much bigger than the rest that in the lantern light it did not look like a bell at all, but like the underside of something. To reach its crown, she had to climb into the frame itself and stand on the pitboard with one arm over the headstock, which she did without asking anybody's leave, in a plate-room woman's grey stuff gown with the lantern hooked on the gudgeon bearing. Ned Curbishley held her ankle. The rector shut his eyes. The crown of a bell is its roof, the flat top where the loops stand up by which it is bolted to its stock. And it is the one part of a bell that nobody ever looks at once it is hung, because the stock covers it, and there is no reason on earth to go up there. The first thing Hester saw was the cannons. There were 6 of them, and a central argent, and they were of a pattern with a thick square section, and a plain fillet at the root, and no founder in England had made them so since before her father was apprenticed. Her own 6 bells, 12 feet away, had the crown her grandfather had drawn in 1771, with round-sectioned loops and a moulded pad under each. The 2 crowns were as different as 2 hands of writing. The second thing she saw was that the crown had been painted. Not painted, stopped. Somebody had gone over the whole flat top of that bell with a stiff mixture of lamp-black and tallow and, in places, a hard grey stopping like a plasterer's cement, and had smeared it about with a rag until the crown was one dull, even dark, and then let a year of tower dust settle onto it. In a bell chamber where everything is black anyway, it was invisible. It would have stayed invisible for 200 years. She said, Mr. Curbishley, is there vinegar in the church? There was vinegar in the vestry, in a bottle kept for the communion linen. There was also in Hester's own pocket, because it had been there since she was 14 and she no longer noticed it, a stub of black heel ball, the hard wax cake that founders and masons and brass rubbers use, and in the rector's desk there was paper. She washed the crown of the tenor with vinegar on a rag, and it took 20 minutes, and turned her hand and her cuff black to the elbow, and the tallow came away, and under the tallow the bronze came up green-black and pitted with the particular pitting that 100 years of bird-lime and damp puts into a bell crown. Then she laid a sheet of the rector's paper flat across it and rubbed the heel ball over the paper in long, even strokes, the way a child takes a rubbing of a church brass. Marks came up white out of the black, 3 bells in a row. Beside them, 2 letters, A.R. Beneath, a date in the plain figures of the last century, the 7 with its bar, the 3 with its flat top. 1738, and running off the edge of the paper, part of a line of raised capitals that had once gone round the crown and had been ground away where it met the waist and survived only up here where the stock had hidden it. The tale of an inscription in a formula that Hester had read on 100 bells and could have finished in her sleep. Prosperity to this parish. She sat down on the pitboard with the paper on her knees. Abraham Rudall II of Gloucester, she said. He was the best founder in England in his day, and he put his mark on the crown of every bell he cast, and he cast this one 78 years before it was hung in your tower. Nobody spoke. Below them the clock train ticked. She said, I want to look inside it. The bells hung mouth down, and the tenor's lip cleared the floor of the chamber by a little over 2 feet, and Hester lay on her back on the boards in her grey gown and pushed herself under it with the lantern held on her breast, into the dark and the smell of old metal, and looked up into a bell she had never made. Inside the crown, where the wolf's tooth should have been, there was nothing at all. Nothing but casting skin and the rough witness of a core 2 generations older than hers. Inside the soundbow, where the bright spiral scars of a lathe chisel should have run round and round the thickest part of the metal in a band 4 inches wide, there was nothing. No cut. No tool had ever been in that bell. What there was instead, at the place where the clapper had beaten for 4 generations of some other parish, was a dish, a shallow, worn hollow in the bronze, polished bright as a shilling by 10,000 ringing days, and out of the lower edge of the hollow, running up towards the waist for 11 inches. A black hairline with a white edge to it, which was the crack that had gone through on the 9th blow of the memorial peal, and which had been there, she thought, and growing, since long before it ever came to Nether Ashcote. She came out from under the bell, and stood up, and did not brush her gown. She said this bell was pulled down out of some tower that was taken down, and bought for the price of its metal, and its inscription was ground off its waist and a new one cut in, and its crown was stopped with tallow, so that nobody would read what is on it, and it was hung in your mother's memory. Nobody cast it for her, nobody tuned it for her. It was worn out before it came here, and it was hung with a clapper made for a modern bell of 21 hundredweight, which is half again what this bell was built to carry, and that is what cracked it, and it would have cracked in the first year whoever had hung it. The Duke said, and his voice had gone very quiet, "Then where is the metal?" And that was the question, and it was the moment at which Hester Kell understood what had actually been done to her. She had believed for 11 months that Silas Prout had ruined her out of the oldest motive in any trade, that he had wanted the foundry and the name and could not have them while she stood in the yard, and had taken his chance when it came. She had lain awake constructing his jealousy in great detail. She had been wrong, and being wrong about it was, in a way she could not explain to anybody for years, the coldest part of the whole business. Nobody had wanted her craft. Nobody had wanted her method, or her ear, or her father's book. There was one reason, and one only why Hester Kell had to be broken and driven out of Wiltshire before the bells went up, and she was lying on her back under it with a lantern on her chest. She was the only person alive who would have climbed into the frame and put her hand on the crown. The estate had bought metal for 8 bells and taken delivery of metal for 6. The 2 heavy bells were where the money was, because a tenor of 21 hundredweight and a 7th of 14 are together above half the weight of a ring of 8, and instead of casting them, somebody had bought a 100-year-old bell out of a demolition for perhaps £40, and a cheap leaded casting from a jobbing brass founder for perhaps 60, and had a letter cutter from Bath make them presentable for 11 guineas. And then that somebody had needed a reason why the ring sounded like a cart falling downstairs, and a reason that would be believed, and would go on being believed, and would keep every competent ear in the county out of that tower for as long as the Duke lived. A woman was a very good reason. A woman was the best reason available. The rest of that day went quickly and got worse. Mr. Gideon Vellicott had been the Duke's agent for 9 years, and he had not survived 9 years in that office by being slow. By 4 in the afternoon, he knew that his Grace had gone up the tower with the plate room woman. By 6, he had been to Marlbrook and back. At 8 o'clock the following morning, in front of the whole servants' hall, Mrs. Dineley was required by Mr. Vellacott, in the presence of a constable and a magistrate's clerk, to have the plate room woman's box brought down and opened. In it, under her linen, wrapped in a piece of green baize, was a silver salt cellar. The room went absolutely silent. Bess Treadgold began to cry. Hester stood by the dresser with her hands in front of her and looked at the thing on the table, and Mr. Vellacott said, in a voice of genuine regret, that this was a very painful business, and that he had feared as much from the first, and that a person turned out of one situation for dishonesty will generally be found. Hester said, "May I see it?" Nobody had thought of a reason to stop her. She picked the salt cellar up, turned it over, held it near the window, and looked at the underside of the foot for about 4 seconds. She said, "The Hallowdene salts are a set of 4, cauldron pattern, on lion's paw feet, assayed at Exeter in 1743. Maker's mark of Pentecost Simons of Plymouth, and all 4 of them are in the plate room at this moment, in the 3rd drawer of the left-hand press, and Mrs. Dineley checked them with me on Friday, and initialed the list. This is not one of them. This is London plate, and it is not even old. That is the leopard's head, that is the lion passant, that is the date letter for 1791, and that is the mark of Hennel, and there is no piece of Hennel's making in this house. It has been bought within the last 4 days from a dealer, and the man who bought it had 30 miles to ride and a shop to open, and I should be very interested to know which of us in this room has had the use of a horse since Tuesday." She put it down on the table. She said, and she was surprised at how steady she was, "I have cleaned every piece of silver in this house 6 days in the week since August. I could tell you the assay year of the sugar tongs in the dark. If I had wished to rob the Duke of Hallowdene, sir, I should not have needed to go to Bath to do it." The Duke, who had come in at the door behind them and had heard the whole of it, said, "Mr. Vellacott, be so good as to give me the keys of the estate office." It took 9 days to build, and Hester built it the way she built a ring of 8, which is to say on paper first. The rector produced the churchwarden's book, and it was the rector who wept, which nobody expected. Josiah Kell had kept a custom his grandfather began, of sending to every parish, with every bell, a fair copy of the tally entry, signed to be pasted into the vestry book, so that the parish should own its own bells in writing, and not be at the mercy of the founder's memory. There were 6 such certificates pasted into the book at Nether Ashcote, in Hester's hand, dated the 29th of September 1816, each giving the diameter at the lip, the height, the thickness at the soundbow, the weight to the pound, the proportion of the alloy, and the 5 voices. There was no certificate for the 7th. There was no certificate for the tenor. There never had been. Mr. Byfield had pasted in what he was given, and had not counted them, and he said so aloud to the room and put his hand over his mouth. Tom Ferris was 19, and had been the bellows boy at Marlbrook, and now carted timber for the estate, and he had to be fetched twice, and sat with his cap in his hands for a long time before he would say it. What he said was that on a night in the October of 1816, 2 bells had come into the yard on a timber wain off the Bath Road, already cast, that one of them was green all over, and had straw and mortar rubbish inside it, and a bird's nest in the crown. That Mr. Prout had put him to holding the horses and told him he had seen nothing, and that a gentleman had given him 5 shillings, and that he had spent it, and that he had been sick about it ever since. Messrs. Robotham and Sons of Bristol sent a clerk named Purslow with the day-book, and Purslow was in the county 9 hours and did more damage than anybody. The estate had been invoiced on the 14th of June 1816 for 5 tons 200 weight of copper and grain tin at £1,046, and the account had been settled in full on the 22nd by a draft on the Duke's bankers. Robothams had delivered 3 tons 1100 weight. The balance had been countermanded by letter on the 19th, and Purslow had the letter in the book, and it was in the hand of Mr. Gideon Vellicott, and no part of the money had ever come back. On the 4th of November 1817, 3 bells were laid out on timber sleds in the forecourt of Hallowdene Court. Getting them down had taken the Salisbury hangers 3 days, with sheer legs over the tower trap and a crab winch in the ringing chamber, and half the parish had stood in the churchyard to watch the tenor come out into the daylight for the first time in a year, swinging slowly on the fall, with the mud of the ground rising to meet it. The forecourt was the biggest flat place on the estate, and it was full. The whole household was there, ranged along the front of the house in their working clothes, because nobody had been told to change. Footmen, grooms, dairymaids, the laundry, Bess Treadgold at the end of the line with her hands over her mouth. The Nether Ashcote band was there, and both churchwardens and the rector, and 11 farmers, and the constable, and a magistrate named Sir Charles Perdue, who had ridden from Devizes, and the organist of St. Mary Marlbrook with his own forks in a case, and a good many people from the village who had no business there at all and were not sent away. It was overcast and cold and perfectly still, which is the best weather in the world for listening. Silas Prout stood by the gate with his hat in his hands. Mr. Vellicott stood where he had always stood, at the Duke's left shoulder, until the Duke moved. Hester had asked for 4 things: the estate hay-scale and its beam, the stone horse trough from the lower yard, 4 empty hogsheads, and a slate. She began with the slate, and it was the slate that afterwards people talked about in the alehouse for 20 years. She said before anything was weighed or struck or rubbed that she would write down what the tests would give, and that Sir Charles should hold the slate, and that if a single figure on it came out wrong, then everything else she had to say might be thrown away with it. She wrote, the 5th bell, a bell of hers, weight 1400 weight 2/4 7 pounds, specific gravity 8 7/10. The 7th bell, weight not above 1100 weight 3/4, specific gravity above 9. And under that she wrote the 5 voices of the 5th, and gave the slate to the magistrate, and stood back. The first test needed no apparatus at all. She invited the churchwardens, and then anybody who chose, to walk along the 3 bells and put their bare hand upon the lettering, and told them what they were feeling before they felt it. On the 5th, she said, the memorial band will stand up under your fingers, and the founder's line beneath it will go down into the metal, because the band was cast and the line was cut afterwards over a ground place. On the 7th and on the tenor, everything will go down, band and line together, because there was never a word cast on either of those bells in its life. 60 or 70 people put their hands on those bells that morning, one after another, some of them twice, and there was a particular sound that a crowd makes when it is being convinced by its own fingers. And it is very quiet. Then she washed the crown of the tenor with vinegar in front of them all, and laid on the paper, and rubbed the heel ball, and held the sheet up. 3 bells, A.R. 1738, and the tale of prosperity to this parish. She passed it to the rector, who passed it to the magistrate, and 2 of the older farmers said they had known the wording before it reached them, their fathers having rung under bells of the same maker at Ogbourne. Then the weighing, which took an hour and was tedious, and Hester had counted on its being tedious, because a thing that is tedious is believed. Her 5th came up on the beam at 14 hundredweight, 2 quarters, 6 pounds, 1 pound under her certificate of the previous September, and 1 pound under her slate, and Sir Charles Perdue read both aloud. The 7th came up at 11 hundredweight, 3 quarters and 4 pounds. Hester stood by the beam with the churchwarden's book open, and said that a bell of that diameter, 41 inches and a half at the lip, built to any honest profile used in England, could not be lighter than 14 hundredweight, and that this one was thin, and that a thin bell in a ring is a hole in the floor. Then the water. She had had the horse trough set on flags, and filled to the brim, and let stand overnight to settle, and the hogsheads weighed empty and marked. She explained it to the forecourt in about 90 seconds, without once looking at the Duke, in the voice she had used for 20 years on carters and furnacemen. Every metal, she said, has a weight of its own for its bulk, and it cannot lie about it. Water is the measure. Good bell metal, 13 of copper to 4 of tin, weighs 8 7/10 times its own bulk of water, and it has done so since before this house was built. Lead weighs above 11 times. If you put lead into bell metal to make it go further, you make it heavier for its bulk, and there is no way on earth to hide that from a trough of water. We shall put a bell of mine in first, so that you may see the method is honest, and then we shall put in the 7th. They lowered the 5th in on the crane chain, mouth tipped, and everybody watched the air come out of it in a broil of bubbles, and watched the bubbles stop, which was Hester's own point, and she made it aloud. A bell is a cup, and a cup full of air will lie to you, so we wait until it has stopped lying. The overflow ran into the first hogshead. They weighed it. Sir Charles did the division himself with a pencil on the back of the slate, twice, because he did not trust the first answer, and announced 8 70/100. They took the 5th out, and put in the 7th. It ran a good deal less water for its weight, and the crowd could see that before any sum was done, and a murmur went along the front of the house. Sir Charles Perdue worked it out, and then worked it out again, and then handed the pencil to the organist of Marlbrook, and made him do it, and then read out 9 14/100. He turned the slate over, and read out what Hester had written on it before the trough was filled, and then he said, to nobody in particular, in the tone of a man who has just been shown a card trick, and understands that it is not a trick, well, that is that. The last of it was the sound, and it took 4 minutes. The 3 bells lay on their sleds. She had the 5th struck at the soundbow with a leather-headed hammer, and named its 5 voices as it rang, and the organist checked each against his forks, and confirmed each aloud, and the nominal, the prime, the tierce, the quint, and the hum were all where she had written them on the slate, and all where she had written them in the vestry book 14 months before. Then she had the crowd stand back and be silent while the last of it died, and the hum of that bell went out flat across the forecourt and over the wall and into the park, and hung there after everything else had gone, and 200 people stood in the cold and heard the note that nobody listens for. Then they struck the 7th, and it made a noise like a man dropping a box of tools, and there was no hum at all. And then they struck the tenor, and the crack buzzed, and a girl in the crowd put her hands over her ears, and the Duke of Hallowdene said, "That is enough. Do not strike it again." Missigidion Vellicott was committed by Sir Charles Perdue that afternoon, and was tried at Salisbury in the March following, and there is no need to follow him any further. Silas Prout was not committed, because the Duke would not have it, and because Hester, asked in front of the magistrate what she wished, said that Mr. Prout had cast good bells for 22 years, and had made one mistake that could not be mended, and that she had no use for him in a gaol. What Prout did then, he did in front of everybody, and it was the only thing he had left to spend. He went to his gig at the gate, and came back with a sack, and out of the sack he took the tally book of Kell and Son bound in dark calf, with 120 years of bells in it, and he put it into her hands, and did not let go of it at once. He said, "I could not tune. I never could. Your father knew it in 1809, and he was kind to me about it, and he never told a living soul, not one, not in 8 years, and I have hated him for that every day since, and I could not tell you why, and I still cannot." Then he let go and walked out of the forecourt, and he sold up in the spring and went to Bristol and worked for another man's foundry until he died, and cast by all accounts perfectly good bells. The yard at Marlbrook came back to her in the February, and she would not take it as a gift. The Duke's solicitors were most anxious that she should, and she said no so often and so flatly that in the end they arranged what she asked for, which was a mortgage at 4% upon her own name, and she paid it off in 6 years, and there is an entry in the front of the tally in her hand, recording the last payment, which is the only entry in the whole book that is not about a bell. The new tenor was poured on the 9th of June 1818. It was 1/20 hundredweight, 48 inches at the lip, 13 of copper to 4 of tin, and the metal was bought by her, and weighed in by her at her own gate. Half the parish came over from Nether Ashcote to stand behind the rope. The Duke came, and was in the yard from 6 in the morning, and was put to carrying sand by a furnaceman who did not recognize him, and carried it, and was afterwards very pleased with himself about it, in a way Hester found she had to look away from. She set the letters herself, on her knees on a plank, as she had done 2 years before. Cecilia, Duchess of Hallowdene, desired that I should sing here, and beneath it, cast into the metal, standing up out of it, made in the mould before ever the bronze was poured, where no chisel and no graver and no letter cutter out of Bath could take it away without leaving a scar that any fool could feel with his thumb. Kell of Marlbrook, M.E. Fessett, 1818. When it was dug out and hoisted and cool, she went to the crown with a cold chisel, and then stopped, and held the chisel out to him. 2 nicks together, she said, and 1 apart. It has been on every bell this house has cast since 1698, and nobody will ever see it again. The Duke of Hallowdene struck the wolf's tooth into the crown of his mother's bell, badly, and had to be shown how to hold the chisel, and the 3rd nick went in crooked, and is crooked to this day. She tuned it in the August. It took her 11 days, and she took more metal out of the shoulder than she had ever taken out of any bell in her life, because she wanted a hum on that bell that would go 2 miles on a still night. And she got one. The Ring of 8 was opened again on the 11th of October 1818, which was the 2nd anniversary of the death of the Dowager Duchess Cecilia, and the 7th bell was new too, and both of them carried her name, and so once more did the other 6. Because the churchwardens had had the ground places filled and recut at the Duke's charge, and had made rather a ceremony of it, Hester Kell did not stand at the back by the like gate. She stood at the front in a plain slate-grey gown, with her father's japanned box in her pocket, because she had never once in her life gone to hear a Ring of 8 without it, and the Duke of Hallowdene stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for the whole of the first course, because you do not talk under bells. They rang for 3/4 of an hour. When the last blow had gone and the sound had come down and stopped, there was that half-second in which everybody breathes, and then, underneath the breathing and the rooks going up out of the yews, and a dog barking somewhere down at the mill, there was the hum still lying across the churchyard, like water finding its level, low and steady and perfectly true, going on after everything else had finished. The Duke said, "Quietly, I hear it." Hester said, "Most people do not." He said, "I know. You told me it was the one that carries." He turned his hat over once in his hands, which she had learned by then was the only nervous thing he ever did, and he said that when she was next in Marlbrook he should like to call upon her, not as a subscriber, and not about a bell. She said that he might. And then they stood there in the cold with the whole parish around them, and listened to the last of it go out over the down, the note that nobody is listening for, the one that is still there when the loud things have stopped, carrying,